The cabin as an American political symbol. Episode 4, the Tiny House Theory Series. This series examines the tiny house not as a trend, but as a historical and political structure. These videos investigate housing, labor, debt, architecture, colonialism, sustainability, mobility, gender, and survival through the cultural figure of the tiny house. In the previous video, the relationship between tiny house culture and the simplicity philosophy of Henry David Thoreau was examined. In this video, the focus shifts toward another recurring architectural figure within tiny house ideology, the cabin. The cabin occupies a powerful position within American political imagination. It appears repeatedly throughout frontier mythology, wilderness culture, survivalism, nationalism, rural romanticism, self-reliance discourse, minimalist architecture, and off-grid living. The cabin is often presented as simple shelter, but historically it has functioned as a political symbol deeply connected to American expansion, settler colonialism, labor ideology, and myths of independence. Tiny house culture inherits many of these symbolic structures. This inheritance matters because the tiny house is frequently framed not only as efficient housing, but as a return to authenticity through simplified dwelling. The cabin helps organize that fantasy. Architecturally, cabins are usually associated with rough construction, small scale, natural materials, rural isolation, self-building, proximity to wilderness. But culturally, the cabin represents much more than physical shelter. It symbolizes a particular relationship between the individual and the land. Within American mythology, the cabin often functions as proof of independence and self-sufficiency. The self-built structure becomes evidence of moral character. Building one's own shelter is framed as a form of honesty, resilience, and freedom from industrial dependency. This symbolic structure developed alongside frontier expansion in North America. As settlers moved westward, cabin construction became associated with territorial occupation and agricultural settlement. Small wooden shelters marked claims to land. They transformed forest and indigenous territories into privatized domestic space. The cabin, therefore, cannot be separated from settler colonial history. It was part of a broader spatial process involving land seizure, territorial expansion, agricultural extraction, displacement of indigenous populations, and the privatization of nature. Yet these histories are often erased within contemporary cabin nostalgia. Instead, the cabin is remembered romantically. It becomes a peaceful retreat, a wilderness refuge, authentic simplicity, masculine survival space, escape from urban modernity. This romanticization continues within tiny house culture. Many tiny houses deliberately imitate cabin aesthetics. Wood cladding, exposed beams, rustic interiors, handcrafted furniture, wood stoves, rural landscapes. The structure visually references frontier mythology, even when technologically sophisticated. This aesthetic language is important because architecture communicates ideology visually. The cabin suggests moral reduction. It implies honesty over excess, labor over luxury, simplicity over corruption, nature over industry. But these oppositions are historically unstable. The frontier cabin was never outside systems of power. It existed within systems of colonization, extraction, and expansion. D.C. Beard's 1914 book, Shelters, Shacks, and Shanties, provides an important example of how cabin culture became connected to American wilderness identity during the early 20th century. Beard presents shelter building as both practical skill and moral education. The book repeatedly frames outdoor construction as character formation through labor and proximity to nature. This is significant because the cabin became tied not only to survival, but to citizenship and masculinity. Wilderness construction culture often framed industrial modernity as weakening or feminizing men. Outdoor shelter building therefore became associated with recovery of strength, independence, and frontier identity. These ideas heavily influenced Boy Scout culture, survival manuals, outdoor education, frontier nostalgia, self-reliance rhetoric. Beard himself was closely connected to the founding culture surrounding the Boy Scouts of America. His writing repeatedly celebrates primitive shelter building as a return to supposedly authentic forms of American culture, of American character, excuse me. This relationship between masculinity and self-built shelter remains visible today. Tiny house culture frequently celebrates DIY construction, hand labor, tool usage, off-grid systems, craftsmanship, and physical building skill. The self-built dwelling becomes morally elevated. Construction itself becomes identity. But there is another contradiction here. The fantasy of self-sufficiency often obscures the industrial systems required to produce contemporary cabins and tiny houses. Even highly rustic structures depend upon processed lumber, manufactured fasteners, industrial insulation, transportation systems, electrical infrastructure, digital communication networks, and legal property systems. The cabin appears independent while remaining deeply interconnected with industrial society. This contradiction also appeared historically. The frontier cabin was never fully autonomous. Settler expansion depended upon military protection, government land policy, transportation routes, agricultural markets, and extraction economies. The myth of isolated independence simplifies these broader systems. Still, the symbolic power of the cabin remains extremely strong. Part of this power comes from the cabin's relationship to industrial anxiety. As cities expanded during the 19th and 20th centuries, cabins increasingly symbolized escape from urban pressure. The cabin became associated with retreat from overcrowding, bureaucracy, industrial labor, social conformity, and technological acceleration. This association continues today. Tiny house media frequently presents small rural dwellings as alternatives to urban exhaustion and informational overload. The visual language is highly consistent. Forests, mountains, lakes, quiet interiors, wood textures, firelight, and slow routines. These images promise emotional relief. The cabin therefore functions psychologically as well as architecturally. It condenses fantasies of control, solitude, autonomy, environmental intimacy, reduced complexity. But this simplicity is often highly curated. Contemporary cabin culture exists comfortably within platform capitalism. Cabin imagery circulates constantly through Instagram, YouTube, Airbnb marketing, architectural blogs, design magazines, and lifestyle branding. Rustic aesthetics become monetized. The cabin becomes a visual commodity. This transformation is especially visible within luxury cabin markets. Expensive minimalist retreats frequently imitate vernacular frontier architecture while functioning as high-end tourism products. Again, simplicity becomes, sorry, aestheticized. The appearance of reduction can coexist with intensive consumption. This is one reason the cabin remains politically unstable as a symbol. It can represent ecological longing, settler nostalgia, anti-consumerist fantasy, luxury branding, survivalism, masculine identity, and nationalist mythology, often simultaneously. Tiny house culture inherits many of these tensions directly. For example, the movement frequently frames mobility and off-grid living as forms of liberation, but mobility itself has a long relationship to frontier expansion and territorial ideology in American history. Movement across land was historically linked to settlement, occupation, extraction, expansionism. The romantic figure of the independent homesteader often conceals these histories. This does not mean contemporary tiny house residents consciously identify with settler colonial ideology, but architectural symbols can carry historical meaning even when their meanings shift over time. The cabin is one of those symbols. It continues organizing emotional ideas about freedom, nurture, simplicity, labor, independence, and authenticity. The emotional durability of these ideas helps explain why cabin aesthetics remain so culturally persuasive during periods of instability. In moments of economic anxiety and ecological uncertainty, the cabin appears materially understandable. it looks survivable. This perception became especially powerful after the 2008 financial collapse. As housing insecurity increased, smaller rural structures appeared to offer reduced exposure to debt and economic pressure. The cabin, therefore, overlaps significantly with recession era tiny house ideology. Both structures promise reduced dependency, simplified life, spatial control, and smaller economic burden. At the same time, however, both remain entangled with broader market systems. Samuel Alexander and his co-authors caution against romanticizing tiny housing as simple escape from structural housing problems. They argue that tiny houses often collide with legal restrictions, planning systems, land politics, and economic realities. The same applies to cabin fantasies more broadly. Retreat does not eliminate infrastructure. Self-building does not eliminate dependency. And rural withdrawal does not necessarily resolve political contradictions surrounding housing, labor, or land ownership. Still, the persistence of cabin culture remains historically revealing. It demonstrates recurring dissatisfaction with dominant forms of industrial and urban life. The cabin survives culturally because it appears to condense moral clarity into architectural form. The smaller shelter suggests that life itself might become slower, more understandable, less indebted, less bureaucratic, and more physically grounded. Whether architecture can actually deliver these promises remains unresolved. But the emotional force of the cabin reveals widespread desire for alternatives to systems experienced as overwhelming or unstable. The cabin therefore matters politically, not because it exists outside modern society, but because it expresses recurring fantasies about escaping from it. Tiny house culture inherits these fantasies directly, and in many cases, it produces them visually, architecturally, and rhetorically through contemporary forms of minimalist domestic design. If this video has examined the cabin as a political and cultural symbol within American housing history, the next video examines how the 2008 housing collapse transformed domestic expectations and helped produce the conditions under which the contemporary tiny house movement rapidly expanded.